In the autumn of 1907, the North Atlantic was in one of her rare forgiving moods. For once, she wasn't trying to kill anyone. The SS Caledonia rode a long, easy swell under a sky of high gray cloud. The air was cold, but it was a clean cold, the kind men on deck could draw deep into salt-scoured lungs without tasting snow or ice. The liner was about halfway through her run from Liverpool to Halifax, with New York to follow. She was not one of the grand record chasers like the Mauretania or the Lusitania. She was a working ship, black hull with a white stripe, twin funnels, 4 decks of cabins, saloons, and cramped steerage. She carried a little under 1,000 people that trip. Merchants and minor gentry in first class, school teachers and clerks in second, families and laborers in steerage, and a crew of 150 whose job, as always, was to keep steel moving over water and water out of steel. At her head was Captain Andrew McKinnon, a broad-shouldered Scotsman in his 50s whose beard was as iron-gray as the sea below. He had gone to sea as a boy and never properly left it. Sail first, then steam. Square riggers in his youth, then ocean-going passenger ships when Britain discovered the money to be made in moving people instead of just cargo. He was not a romantic man. He did not write home about the beauty of icebergs or the majesty of storms. His letters to his wife Anna, preserved in a family tin and later donated to a museum, talk more about clogged bilge pumps and troublesome passengers than sunsets. He respected the Atlantic the way a mill worker respects a machine that can take an arm without slowing. On the morning of 18 October 1907, he came up from his cabin with a mug of tea, just as the 8 bells of the forenoon watch were sounding. Third Officer John Roper was already on the bridge, hat pulled low against the chill, pencil behind his ear as usual. The young man had a gift for neatness. His logbook entries looked like copperplate. His uniform always seemed to have found a way to be clean even in coal dust. "Glass holding?" McKinnon asked, nodding to the barometer bolted to the bulkhead. "Steady for the past 6 hours, sir," Roper replied. "No change worth cursing at." "Wireless?" "Nothing of note, sir," Roper said. "Routine traffic. No wrecks, no derelicts, no dense fog reported on our track. Ice limits well north." McKinnon sipped his tea and looked out over the starboard bow. The Atlantic that day was the color of dull gunmetal. The swell rolled from west to east in long, even hills. Gulls had been scarce since they'd left the Irish coast, just the occasional solitary bird gliding alongside and then turning back. It took him a minute to realize what was bothering him. The texture of the water ahead was wrong. Not the whole ocean, a band of it. 10, maybe 15 miles ahead, stretching roughly across their path, the gray looked smoother, as if someone had dragged a wet knife along the surface, shaving the tops off waves. "Mr. Roper," McKinnon said, "tell me what you see at 2 points on the starboard bow." Roper raised his binoculars, squinted, and frowned. "Looks like a patch of slick, sir," he said. "Oil maybe, or some kind of calm." "We've had no reports of tankers in distress," McKinnon said. "Ask Mr. Price if he's heard any queer signals." In the wireless room, Lewis Price, 23 and proud of his shiny Marconi set, checked his log and the recent scratchings on his notepad. "No, sir," he called back through the voice pipe. "No SOS, no mention of spills, just the usual traffic. Hamburg boat an hour astern of us, Cunard boat southbound somewhere off the Grand Banks, nothing about slicks." The captain's brows drew together. He had been at sea long enough to know that the things you didn't find in the logbooks could be as important as the things you did. "Very well," he said, "we'll keep an eye out." By early afternoon, the patch of smooth water was no longer abstract. Passengers bored of cards and meals and arguments had drifted to the rails, glad of anything that broke the endless, hypnotic horizon. Some said it was a bank of fog lying low on the sea. Others said it was sunlight striking a shoal. Others simply said it was ugly and that they did not like the look of it. At 1523, the man in the foremast lookout platform, Seaman Croft, leaned into his brass speaking tube and called down 5 words that would echo in inquiries and dockside tales for years. "Vessel adrift, no signals showing." Roper repeated it aloud. "A derelict, sir." McKinnon felt his jaw set. "Where away?" he called up the tube. 2 points starboard, maybe a mile," came Croft's reply. "Little off our beam, looks like a freighter, no smoke." Roper had his glasses up before the words were out. "She's there right enough," he confirmed. "Single funnel, 2 masts, riding high, no colors flying." McKinnon took the binoculars. Through their round glass, the world jumped closer. The freighter sat on the strange, flattened water like a fly on cloudy glass. Black hull, morning star, London picked in peeling white along the bow. White painted deckhouses streaked with rust. No smoke from the stack. No wake. Even allowing for distance, she looked unattended. "Helm," he said, handing the glasses back. 2 points to starboard. We'll alter toward her for investigation. Reduce to half speed once we close to a mile. Mr. Roper, have Lewis Price stand by in case we need to signal. Also get Dr. Brent up to the bridge." "Aye, aye, sir." There were rules about these things. The law of the sea, older than any Board of Trade regulation, said that you did not sail past another vessel that might be in trouble if you could do anything about it. It also said that if you found a ship abandoned and saved her from destruction, you had a right to a claim on her value. Some captains thought more about the first part, some thought more about the second. McKinnon, to his credit, thought first about the possibility of men alive on that silent deck, and only second about salvage. The Caledonia turned her black prow toward the morning star. Passengers drifted along behind her, an ant line of curiosity moving to starboard. Snatches of their talk blew back, questions, speculation, a woman laughing too loudly and then cutting herself short when she saw the crew's faces. By the time they were half a mile away, the freighter filled a good chunk of the field of view. "No smoke, no flag, no men." "Glass shows nothing odd," Dr. Samuel Brent reported when he arrived. "No sudden change in pressure, no shift in temperature. Whatever's wrong with that ship didn't ride down a barometer." "Dead calm around her," Roper murmured. He was right. The strange slick on the water now revealed itself for what it was, a ring. Not perfect, but obvious. The sea within a few ship lengths of the Morning Star's hull lay flatter than the swell outside, not glassy, but muted. The Caledonia's own bow wave, when it reached that ring, lost some of its frill and seemed to mend itself into the surrounding surface with unnatural speed. Like someone poured oil around her and then swept the bottle away, Roper said under his breath. At 4 cables, McKinnon ordered the engines down to dead slow. Men on the Caledonia's forecastle readied the No. 2 lifeboat, swung it out. On the freighter, nothing moved. Then something did. Near the forward hatch, just abaft the break of the forecastle, a human shape lay slumped against the coaming. As the angle between the ships changed, the light shifted, and the pale oval of a face turned slightly into view. Several passengers gasped. One woman gave a little scream and clutched her husband's arm. Captain McKinnon, who had seen drownings and burns and things worse than both, felt the hairs on his arms lift. He did not like how still that face was. "Up in the crow's nest," Croft said quietly to himself, "Christ have mercy on us." "Mr. Roper," McKinnon said, "you'll take Macready, Olson, Pritchard, and Dr. Brent across. Full equipment. See who lives and who doesn't. Take care of yourself." "Aye, aye, sir." The orders went down the chain. The lifeboat splashed steadied. Men slid down the Jacob's ladders and dropped in. Oars bit. The distance was not great, but something about the band of strange water made it feel longer. Olson would say later that his arms ached more in those 200 yards than they should have. "It's like rowing through someone's breath," he told his bunkmate. "Not wind, breath." They bumped the Morning Star's hull. The ladder they chose was rusty but held. Macready went first. The bosun's boots thudded onto the freighter's deck. Roper followed, then Pritchard, then Olson, then Brent, each man fighting the irrational urge to look over his shoulder as the gig drifted a yard or two away. The smell hit them at once. It was not overwhelming. The October air was too cold for that, but it was there, under the tang of salt and steel, the sour sweet of corruption. "Jesus," Pritchard muttered. "Steady," Roper said. "We've all smelt worse in dockside alleys. Get it done." They knelt by the man at the hatch. He was perhaps 30, perhaps older. Death had smudged age. His shirt was open at the throat. His skin had swollen, livid, unnatural colors mottled it. The eyes had dulled to marbles. "Been gone some days," Brent said, keeping professional distance between his mind and the flesh. "Not long enough to bloat fully, not short enough to mistake for fainting." They found 3 more like him within the first 5 minutes. One wedged under the starboard rail, one face down near the winch, one half hanging out of the doorway to the galley, arm caught. Below deck, bunks and tables told the story of sudden interruption. A stew pot sat on a cold stove with a gray skin on its surface. Cups stood half full of what might have been weak tea. A checkerboard lay mid-game. No obvious sign of struggle, no overturned chairs, no blood splashed in the corridors. Just absence and the thick feeling of a place that had been busy, and then, suddenly, was not. In the engine room, the furnaces yawned empty. No heat radiated from the boilers. Condensation dripped lazily from pipes. It was as if the heart had stopped and the body was figuring out what to do. Back on the bridge, Roper found the log. He read the last entries twice before calling the others to hear. October 10th, fog thick since dawn, air curiously still, sea taking on oily appearance. Crew unsettled. Voices reported forward, singing, calling, no source seen. No other vessels in sight or on wireless. Ordered men not to answer, to hold their posts. He flipped the page. October 11th, fog persists. Men swear they hear their mothers, wives, children calling from water. One man claims to have seen a figure on starboard beam, no ship beneath it. 2 men left their station on forecastle head last watch and did not return. No splash heard. Nothing found. Discipline strained. I confess myself. The line trailed into an illegible blot. "Voices in fog," Brent said slowly. "Not unheard of in a manner of speaking. The brain can do tricks when deprived of clear landmarks." "And the flattened sea?" Roper asked. "The fact that we're the only ones to log any weather like this." Brent had no answer for that. They went back to the Caledonia. They told Captain McKinnon what they'd found. The dead, the log, the lack of obvious physical cause. He weighed salvage against risk, law against dread, and gave the order that would shape the rest of their lives. "We take her in tow." They would spend only 3 nights with that decision following them. It would be enough. The decision, in the end, took less than 5 minutes. From the Caledonia's bridge it looked straightforward. A dead freighter in a busy lane, weather workable, room to rig a hawser and drag her in. From the Morning Star's deck, among her sprawled crew, the choice felt very different. But decisions at sea are made from the bridge, not from the silence of another ship's mess. "Her hull's sound," Captain McKinnon said. "Her cargo's still aboard. Her engines are dead, but that suits us fine. If we leave her drifting here, we deserve what comes of it. We put a riding crew aboard and take her into Halifax." There were no volunteers in the heroic sense. There were men who nodded because that was what officers did when the captain said, "You will go." Third Officer John Roper was one of those men. He took the assignment without flourish. "Yes, sir," he said simply. I'll take Bosun Macready in 2 hands, Dr. Brent if you'll have it. Dr. Samuel Brent, who had spent the afternoon bending over dead men and trying to pretend they were interesting puzzles rather than people, did not want it. He also did not particularly want to leave whatever killed those men completely unexamined. "I will come, Captain," he said, "but I reserve the right to dislike the experience." "Dislike it as much as you please," McKinnon answered. "Just stay breathing." They rigged the tow in the late light of the day. A hawser as thick as a man's thigh was brought up from the Caledonia's forward rope locker, laid out in great coils on her forecastle, and attached to a smaller messenger line. That line went first, fired across on a rocket and hauled in by sweating arms on the Morning Star's bow. Roper and his men, back aboard the freighter, bent the hawser to the Morning Star's bitts and took out the slack in cautious stages, listening for complaints in the old metal. There were none. The steel groaned but accepted. When the big rope finally came taut, the dead ship gave a small, reluctant jerk and then began to move. From the Caledonia's rail, passengers watched the spectacle. It looked to their untrained eyes almost like a tame circus trick. 2 ships, one powerful and one ragged, gliding together in harness. A few even clapped. On the Morning Star's deck, with the smell of old death in their throats and rust under their hands, the men on the hawser did not feel like applauding. "The first rule," Bosun Hugh Macready said, voice low as they coiled the last stray lines, "is that we do not split up. We go everywhere in pairs. No one goes below alone. No one goes forward alone. If you have to so much as take a piss, you take a friend." "Second rule," Roper added, "is that we remember why we're here. We are not ghost hunting. We are not solving mysteries. We are making sure this wreck doesn't tear itself loose, set itself on fire, or drag us sideways into trouble. That's all." He looked pointedly at Pritchard and Olson. "Third rule, we do not start seeing more than is there just because we know men died here. If you are unsure you saw or heard something, assume fatigue first, madness second, ghosts a distant third. I'd like us all to get paid for this stunt, not removed from duty." "Aye, aye, sir," they chorused, none entirely reassured. They made their small camp in the Morning Star's crew mess. It was a low, narrow room with bolted tables, now scattered with dusty cups and the remnants of someone else's card game. A grimy porthole let in a weak triangle of gray. They swept the worst debris aside, rolled out blankets on the benches, and hung a lantern from the overhead. Olson, superstitious by nature, muttered a brief prayer in Norwegian under his breath as he set his kit down. "No harm in covering all sides," he said when Pritchard raised an eyebrow. They posted their first watch. Macready and Olson took the deck from 8 to 10. Roper and Pritchard would follow. Dr. Brent, not being seaman enough to be much use in the dark, was told to sleep when he could and be on call. Up on the freighter's bridge, the view was both comforting and unnerving. Ahead, the Caledonia filled their world. Big black stern, white wake boiling, deck lights glowing in orderly rows. She looked in that moment like a moving island of sanity. Around them the world shrank. The odd patch of flattened water spread out around the Morning Star like a pale halo. Beyond it, the Atlantic rumbled, but here the swell felt blunted. The ship did not so much ride the waves as slide along their backs. "It's like we're in the lee of something we can't see," Macready said. From 8 to 9, nothing happened. They walked the decks, lamps sweeping rail and rigging. The corpses lay where they'd found them, one by the hatch, one by the rail, one half hidden near the winch. Every time they passed, the bosun caught himself checking if a hand had moved or an eye had opened. "Stop staring at them," he told himself. "The more you look, the more you'll ess." Lee. From 9 to 10, the sea darkened from gray to blank. The Caledonia's stern light became a single bright coin ahead. Their world shrank to the span of the lanterns and the thrum of the hawser. At 10, McCready woke Roper and traded watches. "Quiet?" Roper asked. "Yes and no," the bosun said. "No movement, no trouble, but it's that sort of quiet that makes you think something's listening." Roper tried to sleep on the bench. He lasted about 20 minutes. Every time his eyes closed, his mind conjured images of dead men getting slowly to their feet behind a closed door, of footsteps on steel. He gave up, swung his legs off the bench, and went to join Pritchard on the bridge. The night had dropped like a curtain. Moisture beaded on the glass in soft arcs, obscuring the liner ahead. When he wiped it away with his sleeve, it returned almost at once. "Fog coming in?" he asked. "Doesn't look like it beyond the ship," Pritchard said. "Their stern light's clear enough. Feels more like the air's thinking about it around us only." They did their rounds. As they came abreast of the hatch corpse for the third time, Roper stopped. "I could swear his arm was in a different place before," he said. "What?" Pritchard stiffened. "I may be wrong," Roper said quickly. "Memory is a poor thing at sea, especially in this light. We'll mark it." He noted the position in his pocketbook. Hand 2 planks from combing, fingers curled inward. On their next pass an hour later, the dark fingers lay a plank farther out. They had not heard any scrape. They had not felt any roll violent enough to shift a stiffening body. Roper closed his book more sharply than necessary. "Gas," he told himself. "Swelling, settling, anything but what it looks like." He did not say aloud that nothing about the way that hand lay looked like muscle falling slack. It looked, in some obscene small way, like intent. Later, when he made his official statement, he would phrase it more cautiously. "It appeared to me that the limbs of certain corpses had altered position between watches. I cannot with certainty state that they did so of their own power. By midnight, they were all tired enough that fear dulled to a background pain." On the Caledonia, bells marked the watches as usual. Stewards carried late trays to cabins. Someone in the smoking room drew laughter with a story about a vicar and a chambermaid. On the Morning Star, 5 men stared into a damp dark and updated their personal definitions of ordinary. Nothing more overt happened that first night. They all heard creaks that might have been footsteps. They all heard muted thumps that might have been cargo settling. None of them, afterwards, claimed to have heard voices. That came later. The following day passed in sullen gray. The fog, which had threatened in the early hours, stayed away. The Caledonia's black flanks were a constant presence ahead, spray fanning out from her bows. On the Morning Star, the strange smoothness of the water never entirely left, but it felt thinner, less like a presence and more like a memory. "We'll be in Halifax inside of 3 days at this rate," McCready said at midday, peering at the smoke from the liner's stacks. "Tows going as well as can be expected, considering." "Considering the crew complement," Olson muttered. They used the daylight to make a more thorough inspection. Brent checked a few more bodies, more out of duty than desire. In a narrow passage aft he found one corpse sitting upright on the deck, back to the bulkhead, hands clasped around a flask. His eyes, half-lidded, stared at nothing. "Heart went," Brent said. "Or his mind did first. He probably just slid down and never came back up." On the port side deck alley, hidden behind a pile of canvas, they discovered a chalked note on the paint at knee level. "Keep your mouth shut." "Did the port health man mention that?" Pritchard asked later, half accusatory. "No," Roper said, frowning. "He noted only the carved line we saw after we docked. Don't answer THEM. This must have been older. Some poor devil trying to leave advice no one lived long enough to read." They found nothing else that felt like new information. By the time the second night approached, they allowed themselves to believe they had perhaps seen the worst of it. They were wrong. It began subtly. Just before 8 bells of the first watch, as dusk sank into a thicker shade, the Caledonia's stern light, their bright tether in the dark blurred. Roper wiped the bridge glass. The droplets reformed. He stepped out to the wing. A faint mist clung low over the water, thicker around the morning star than beyond. It did not blow, it hung. The horizon vanished. Their world shrank to the smear of light ahead and the lamp on their own mast. He signaled across. "Fog around tow, are you affected?" The answer, flashed back in brisk Morse, came from Price on the Caledonia. "Negative, visibility G. Ood, air damp but no appreciable fog, can see you clearly. What do you see?" Roper hesitated, then replied. "Local mist, proceeding with caution." He did not mention the way the air on their decks seemed to swallow sound. Lanterns glowed more dimly. The muffled thud of the tow line through the bits felt, weirdly, like a heartbeat. As Macready and Olson started their circuit, the first of the new sounds crept in. At first it was only a faint murmur. "The ship talking," Olson said, trying to be flippant. Then from somewhere under their boots, a clear, full-throated line of song burst out. "Walk away, boys, walk away. Walk away, boys, walk away." It was an old capstan shanty, the kind men used to drag heavy rope when their backs are already sore. There was no one to sing it. It came from no single point. The metal seemed to be its throat. It cut off as soon as Macready shouted, "Who's there?" Silence fell like a lid. Olson licked dry lips. "That sounded like any of them might have when they were alive," he said. "Which is exactly the trouble," Macready answered. "Get Mr. Roper." By the time Roper and Brent reached the deck, the sound had not returned. They stood in the fog listening. Nothing. Except, very softly, from somewhere beneath the hatch the first corpse lay against, a voice muttered, "Get down to it, you sods. You'll never get in if you pull like old women." The tone was that of a petty officer tired of slow work. Brent swallowed. That, he said, was well articulated for gas. No one contradicted him. They resumed their pattern. They did not now walk the decks in whistling camaraderie. They moved like men scouting trenches, slow, close together, lantern beams overlapping. Twice, as the night deepened, Roper thought he heard a step on the deck behind him that matched his own, half a beat late. Each time he turned, there was only Pritchard. Each time he wished he found something else, just so the anticipation would end. Somewhere after midnight, the nature of the noises changed again. The ship started knocking. It began in the forecastle, a light irregular tapping in the steel, like someone rattling a spoon against a pipe 3 decks below. Tap tap. Pause. Tap. Tap tap tap. Roper, trying to keep his mind on bolt ropes and chafing gear, found himself mapping the sounds against Morse without meaning to. Short 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 S. Short long short R. Nonsense, or worse, fragments. At one point the pattern seemed to spell out JOH, and then descended into random. "Your ears are not your friends," he told himself, echoing a very different guide in a very different forest. Around 2 in the morning, when exhaustion was at its cruelest and self-control at its thinnest, something else happened. A steward on the Caledonia, sneaking out to the boat deck for a contraband cigarette, looked astern and froze. Later, in a letter never sent, he would write, "I saw them on the rope, Ma, not swinging, not like flags, but moving, like men climbing hand over hand from the small ship to ours. I could not see their faces, only that their clothes were wrong, not like our uniform, old, and they were too still for men working. I dropped my smoke into the sea and went back inside. I told no one. I was more afraid of being laughed at than of what might be behind me." He put none of that in his official crew statement. Fear of ridicule is often a stronger silence than fear of ghosts. The third night, by every dry measure, should have been the easiest. They were within 24 hours of Halifax. The sea had settled into a steady heave. No gales threatened. Ice was a far rumor. On the Caledonia, passengers were packing trunks and arguing about tips. The ship's small chapel, where Captain McKinnon had asked Father O'Leary to offer mass for the dead, smelt of candle wax and stale incense. On the Morning Star, fog returned with a vengeance. It wrapped the deck in a wall of gray that seemed to start an arm's length from their faces. The Caledonia's stern light was a dull lamp in cotton. "Feels like being towed inside someone's lung," Pritchard said, nerves frayed to the point where his metaphors had lost their polish. They moved through the night as they had the previous ones, in pairs, never alone, never far from the bridge. Sometime near 4 in the morning, just before the sky began to think of lightning, the ship under them tried to move of her own accord. Roper was on the bridge with Macready, both men bone-tired. The wheel had been lashed and left. There was, in theory, nothing for it to do. Without warning, the spokes twitched. The lashings creaked. The wheel shifted a fraction to port, then back. Then, with a pressure like a hand leaning into it, it turned until the rope tautened hard. On the Caledonia's bridge, the helmsman felt his own wheel lurch. "Toes pulling, sir," he shouted. McKinnon grabbed the spokes. The feel through the wood was peckle. Ire, not the chaotic yank of a hawser gone slack or a wave hitting off the beam, but a steady, stubborn drag, as if something large on the end of the line had decided, purposively, to walk sideways. "Ease her," McKinnon said through his teeth. "No sudden corrections. We don't want to start her swinging." He signaled down to the engine room to stand by. Behind, on the Morning Star, Roper and Macready cut the lashings and seized the wheel. The resistance was undeniable. The dead ship's rudder, which should have been nothing more than a slab of metal the sea pushed where the hawser urged, now felt like a live thing. "Hold her straight," Roper grunted. "Whatever your hands tell you, hold her to the line." Together they leaned against the spin. After long, straining seconds, the pressure eased. The wheel settled back toward center. The pull through the hawser diminished. Ahead, the Caledonia's stern light drifted back into its rightful place. When they checked the lashings afterwards, the rope was burned shiny where it had scraped hard against the wheel spokes. "If it had wanted to, it could have turned us across the hawser," Macready said, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cold. "Let her plow into our quarter. That would have been a mess." "It doesn't know what it wants," Roper said. "That's worse." He stood listening to the fog until the bells of the Caledonia's watch drifted back. Bright, ordinary sound cutting through the gloom. "Another 12 hours," he said, "and we hand her over to harbor men and wash our hands." He would wash his. He doubted even then that the Morning Star ever truly would. By mid-morning, the outline of Nova Scotia began to emerge from the haze. Dirty snow on low hills, the faint, jagged teeth of cranes above docks, a lighthouse sending its measured pulse across winter water. Pilot boats came out, lines were thrown, instructions exchanged. The Caledonia released most of the strain on the tow and allowed harbor tugs to take some. From the shore to civilian eyes it looked almost mundane. Big ship, small damaged one behind, men fussing with ropes, business as usual. Those who had spent the last 3 days walking the Morning Star's decks knew different. The moment the tugs had her in hand, and the Caledonia had sounded a final 3-blast salute, Roper brought his small crew to the ladder. "Thank you, gentlemen," he said, voice hoarse. "You've done what was asked and more. Down you go." They climbed into the waiting launch, boots hitting its planks with a weight they all felt as more than gravity. As they pulled away, Dr. Brent looked back. On the Morning Star's deck, the dead lay in their final positions. For a second, just a second, he thought he saw one of the slumped figures raise a hand in a grotesque imitation of a wave. He did not mention it later. By the time the Evening Chronicle splashed its headline, Liner tows death ship into Halifax, crew all dead. The Morning Star was already in the hands of Harbor Health, Customs, and eventually the Board of Trade. The Caledonia took on coal and passengers, took on inquiries and rumors, and after a few days sailed away again. Schedules wait for no haunting. The file, however, the file that would decades later find its way into the Outland Archives, was only beginning to fill. When the Morning Star came into Halifax, the harbor seemed, for a few hours, more interested in her than in the much larger vessel that had towed her. Tugs nosed around the two ships like terriers around a pair of mismatched carts. Small boats darted out, their crews staring. Longshoremen along the quays framed the scene with calloused hands and compared it to whatever previous horror they had seen dragged in. Newspaper men smelled a story. By late afternoon, a dozen rough sketches had already been inked showing a heroic liner towing a broken freighter, all skulls and tattered sails in the illustrator's imagination. The reality at berth 12 was quieter and much worse. The Morning Star was warped alongside gently, thick hawsers taking her weight. Her paint, already in poor shape, looked even more sickly under the harbor's gray light. The pale sheen of the odd slick washed against her plates and then began to thin, mixing reluctantly into the rest of the harbor water. Port Health went aboard first. The senior officer, Dr. Halloran, had seen his share of dead ships. Cholera in the 1890s, smallpox scares, yellow-marked hulls kept stubbornly offshore. He walked up the gangway with masks and regulations in mind. No one had yet told him about voices. He took 2 assistants, an inspector from Customs, and a sergeant with 3 constables in case anything living objected to questions. They found what they expected in outline. Corpses. More than the Caledonia's boarding party had been able to catalog in their limited forays. There was the man by the hatch, the one at the rail, the bloated form beside the winch. But there were also others, in bunks, in narrow passages, in the galley, in the engine room, in the head. A man seated at a table with his head in his arms, as if he had simply fallen asleep over a plate. Another lying half in and half out of a cold furnace, as if he had been checking something and his legs had forgotten the rest. Dr. Halloran moved amongst them with the brisk sadness of professional habit. "No rash," he muttered, rolling up a sleeve. "No petechiae, no signs of hemorrhagic fever, eyes not yellow enough for jaundice, tongues a bit swollen, but that could be post-mortem." He checked glands, chest, tongues, pierced arms, the delicate inside of eyelids. He found nothing he could point at and say, "Here, this is the thing that did it." They reached the portside alley. There, under a heap of tarpaulins matted with salt and dust, they found one more. He lay curled on his side like a child. His nails, what remained of them, were torn down past the quick. Skin hung ragged from his fingertips. His mouth was stretched open in a silent scream that had never quite finished. Under his hands, carved shallowly into the painted steel with some sharp tool, were the words, "Don't answer them." The letters were shaky and irregular, as if written in a hurry with failing strength. A few strokes crossed others, as if some attempt had been made to scratch them out and then over-scratch the erasure. The constable with Halloran swore softly. "What in hell does that mean?" the sergeant asked. "It means," Halloran said quietly, "that whatever they were hearing, at least one man realized he ought not to reply. He noted it in his book. The fact that the port press would seize on that detail, above almost all others, did not occur to him then. He was more concerned with whether any of this might be catching. The answer, as far as medicine of the day could tell, was no. Bodies were identified as best they could be from the Morning Star's own crew list. The dead were taken ashore one by one and given as much dignity as hosed-down body bags and a rushed harbor burial could supply. Samples were cut, jars filled, labels written. The ship's log, and a selection of personal effects went into a sealed box for the Board of Trade. The Caledonia, having fulfilled her immediate obligations and had her hull inspected for any harm from the tow, began taking on coal and mail for the next leg of her run. Her passengers disembarked, told lurid stories in hotel bars, and scattered. For the officers who had walked the Morning Star's decks, departure did not feel quite like leaving. It felt like stepping backward from something that was still, in some way, watching. Third Officer Roper, in a letter to his brother that he never posted, put it this way: "I have been on ships in storms that behaved like wild horses, and I have loved some of them for it. The Morning Star under tow was like a dog that has been beaten too much and snaps at everyone, including the hand that feeds it. Even now, ashore and in sunlight, I catch myself listening for that damned tapping in the floor." Captain McKinnon, in a neat hand less inclined to confession, noted simply in his private notebook, "If ever there was a ship that wanted company at any cost, she was it." The Board of Trade inquiry convened 10 days later. In a Halifax municipal building that normally hosted ratepayers, meetings, and petty legal disputes. For a week, its biggest cases had involved collapsed sheds and pilfered fish. Now the long room smelled of more serious things: wet wool, stale cigarette smoke, and the heavy tang of many men's unease. At the far end sat the panel. The chairman, Sir William Havisham, had a dry face and the air of a man who trusted charts more than stories. Beside him sat a local magistrate, a representative from the Admiralty, and a clerk already ink-stained on the first morning. On one side of the room, neat in their uniforms, stood the officers of the Caledonia: McKinnon, Chief Officer Fraser, Third Officer Roper, and Dr. Brent. On the other, in less orderly attire, were representatives of the Morning Star's owning company, a few port officials, and a scattering of sailors and stevedores drawn more by curiosity than summons. The freighter's own master was not there. His body had been buried 3 days earlier in a cold Halifax grave, the prayers said by a harried harbor chaplain who had not known his name when he opened his book. The board began with the obvious. Captain McKinnon testified first. He described leaving Liverpool, the course, the weather, the sighting of the unusual patch of flattened sea, and the initial visual on the drifting freighter. His voice remained steady. "How far off your track was the Morning Star when first sighted?" the chairman asked. "Approximately 1 mile abeam, sir," McKinnon replied. "Perhaps less. Close enough that had we continued in ignorance, we might have come uncomfortably near her by night." "You altered course immediately?" "Yes, sir." "And your reasons?" "Twofold," McKinnon said. "One, to render assistance if needed. 2, to ascertain whether she posed a risk as a derelict. It was my judgment that doing otherwise would have been contrary to good seamanship." The board nodded. They liked clarity. He described sending the boarding party, hearing their report, reading the Morning Star's log, and making the decision to tow. "Do you believe now that you were right to do so?" Havisham asked. McKinnon hesitated only a second. "Yes, sir," he said. "I believe leaving her to drift crewless across that lane would have been worse. I do not deny that in hindsight, knowing what my men experienced on board, I might have thought twice. But I cannot say I would have chosen differently. Another ship might have struck her in clear weather. The fault then would have been mine as much as Providence's." The board moved on to Third Officer Roper. His testimony took longer. He spoke of climbing the freighter's ladder and smelling decay. He described the bodies on deck, the state of the accommodation, the silent engine room. He read aloud the last log entry about fog and voices. The word voices made the panel shift in their seats. "Mr. Roper," Havisham said, steepling his fingers, "in your own words, what weight did you give that log entry at the time?" "To be candid, sir," Roper said, "I took it initially as evidence of a breakdown in discipline. The master was clearly under strain. Men hearing mothers and wives in the fog is not conducive to clear thinking. At sea, we are all taught to distrust that sort of thing. And yet, Havisham pressed, you later report your own crew hearing something similar while under tow. Yes, sir, Roper said quietly. Please elaborate. Roper swallowed. He had spent 10 days thinking about exactly how to describe what he had heard without sounding like a man who should not be trusted on a bridge. On the second night, he said, while we were in a patch of local mist surrounding the Morning Star, Boatswain Macready and able seaman Pritchard, and later myself, heard what we all took to be a sailor's hauling song. It came, as best we could tell, from below the main deck. It had words, not random notes. It ceased when challenged. We confirmed by wireless that no such song was being used on the Caledonia at the time. And could it have been the memory of such a song in your own minds, projected, as it were, onto ambient noise? One of the others asked, half skeptical. Perhaps, Roper allowed. But usually when three men mishear the same thing, there is something there to mishear. He went on. He mentioned the knocking, like code, but not quite. The slight movements of the bodies, the way the wheel had seemed to fight them just before Halifax. Dr. Brent backed him insofar as he could without abandoning his own caution. I saw rigor loosen and limbs shift as gases built and escaped, he said. That is not unusual. The way the men reacted to those shifts, given the context, is another matter. They were primed to see and hear more than was likely true. That is how minds behave under fear. And the cause of death, the board asked. You have hinted in your written report that you can find no single illness or injury responsible. The T is correct, Brent said. Some died of exposure, some likely of heart failure, perhaps brought on by shock. One or two took their own lives. The rest, it would be easy, but irresponsible, for me to chalk up to fright. Yet when a man dies in his bunk with no mark on him and an empty plate by his head, I am forced to admit that our understanding of what can push a heart past endurance is incomplete. Do you, Doctor, Havisham said, ascribe any of this to supernatural causes? Brent looked down at his hands for a long moment. I am not a priest, he said. I am a doctor. When a man is dead, I can tell you with some accuracy what has ceased to function. When many men die and their bodies tell me nothing definite, I can tell you that ignorance remains. Whether something beyond our present knowledge pushed their minds to collapse is not, I'm afraid, a question my instruments can answer. Which was the most dignified way he could find to say, I do not know. The board also heard from the port health officer about the carved warning. The phrase, don't answer THEM, entered the record. So did the smaller chalked note, keep your mouth shut, found earlier along the alley. Gentlemen, Havisham said at one point, removing his glasses to polish them, it seems that at least one member of the Morning Star's crew believed that responding to something he heard was dangerous. Whether that something was internal or external is, of course, open to interpretation. You have not asked, Roper said then, surprising himself, about the way the sea behaved. Havisham looked up. We have made note of your description of flattened water around the vessel, he said. We are inclined to attribute that to some localized phenomenon, oil from bilges, for instance. With respect, sir, Roper said, I have seen slicks from oil and they do not behave like that. The water under her was not simply shiny. It seemed to react differently to our own wake, as if something in it preferred the surface remain undisturbed. Havisham jotted a line anyway. The Admiralty representative added a note of his own that would become a one-sentence caution in the hydrographic circular. Reports of unusual calm patches in region 49 degrees and 33 degrees W. Masters are advised to maintain vigilance, but no alteration to lanes deemed necessary. Officially, that was as far as they were willing to go. Unofficially, sailors drew their own charts. On copies of route maps passed from hand to hand, a few pencil circles appeared around that coordinate, labeled in rough script. Morning Star patch, bad weather for the head. So what happened aboard the Morning Star in that week of fog before the Caledonia found her? The Board of Trade left it at fog, fear, and failure of discipline. The owner's insurance underwriters preferred breakdown of command. The chaplain in Liverpool, who eventually read committal over some of the dead, wrote temptation in his private journal and underlined it twice. The Outland Archives, with the luxury of not having to settle claims or defend doctrines, can consider more possibilities. One is still thoroughly mundane, acoustic illusion and suggestion. In dense fog on a featureless sea, sound travels strangely. Waves slap against a hull and bounce back in phase with others. Wind moans in a vent. A rope creaks. A man, already unnerved, hears in those patterns something he recognizes. He turns to his neighbor and says, "Did you hear that? It sounded like my mother." His neighbor, perhaps also missing his own mother, listens more closely the next time and hears, not an exact match, but a similar cadence. Soon word spreads that the fog is talking. Every splash and groan gets filtered through that idea. In that atmosphere, a few men might very well walk off the forecastle head into blank white, convinced they see someone where there is only air. As men disappear, as watches get thin, as the engine crew grows jittery, the ship's heartbeat of routines falters. Meals are missed. Sleep is ruined. Hearts already compromised by drink or strain give out. Everything that followed could, under this model, be human minds turned to weapons by a hostile environment. The second possibility adds a more specific poison. Perhaps some cargo in the Morning Star's hold, unlisted or unrecognized, leaked toxic vapor. Many industrial chemicals being shipped in the first decade of the 20th century were poorly understood. Fumes might cause auditory and visual hallucinations without leaving obvious lesions or marks recognizable to 1907 medicine. Under this view, the voices were not purely psychological, they were chemically induced. The fog might have been condensation of some kind. The odd smooth water around the hull might have been a byproduct of whatever had spilled. The trouble with this explanation is the manifest, which lists nothing so exotic, and the lack of corrosion or other damage one might expect from a major spill. The third possibility edges us closer to the language the Morning Star's own men used in their last scribbled warnings, something that wants to be answered. Whether you call that something a spirit, an emergent phenomenon of sea and weather, or a pattern of psychological contagion is almost secondary. What matters is the form the danger took. It did not shine a strange light on the water or send up phantom ships. It did not roar. It spoke. And when its first efforts, anonymous singing, vague calls, did not work well enough, it seems to have refined its method, reaching for more intimate hooks, childhood songs, mothers, tones, personal endearments. On that reading, the Morning Star was a hunting ground. Her crew were, for a span of days, forced to work not only against fatigue, rust, and the usual hazards of steam, but against something that had found a way to turn their deepest loyalties against them. Their last attempt at resistance was not to shoot at it or flee it, but to leave advice for whoever came next. Don't answer them. Keep your mouth shut. Advice the Caledonia's men, perhaps by luck and discipline, mostly followed. When they heard songs, they did not sing back. When they heard insults, they did not trade them. They did not lean over the rails at night when a voice in the fog said, in a suddenly familiar cadence, "Here, John," or "Over here, lad." If anything supernatural was leaning close under those decks, it must have found that very frustrating. There is one more thread in the file, easily overlooked, the wireless log. Lewis Price, the young operator on the Caledonia, was as fastidious in his private notebooks as he was in official records. In the weeks after the Halifax incident, as the liner resumed her normal crossings, he logged a series of faint, broken transmissions on nights when his instruments otherwise behaved perfectly. They came not when he expected messages, not in the busy traffic around landfalls or in the scheduled time windows for major liners, but in the small, dead hours between 2 and 4 in the morning, when the ocean's own noises seemed loudest. They all had the same call sign, MSL. That should have been the Morning Stars, but by then, officially, it was struck from the lists. The content, when he could pull it from static, was limited and repetitive. Fog thick stop, cannot see bow stop, hear them again stop. They say my name stop, men won't stay, ATPOSTS stop. If anyone hears this, do not answer them stop. Price was not foolish enough to put those in the company log. He wrote them in his private book, shook his head, and told himself that fading signals and atmospheric bounce could throw orphaned code groups around the Atlantic for days. He knew that messages sometimes arrived long after they were sent. He also knew that the Morning Star's last wireless operator, a man named Cartwright, had stopped transmitting a week before they'd towed the ship into harbor. Probably old stuff, he told Roper one evening, half hoping to be reassured. Then why is it always at the same hour? Roper asked. Neither had an answer. The Outland Archives does not, as a matter of policy, declare that ghost messages travel perpetually in radio waves like ships lost in fog forever. What it does note is this: men, when they try to warn others about a danger they do not fully understand, tend to repeat themselves. Those carved and chalked phrases on the deck, those fragments of Morse pulled from static, those half-remembered shanties tapped in steel all carry the same core plea. Do not let what fooled us fool you. More than a century has passed since the Caledonia towed the Morning Star into Halifax. The freighter is long since gone, stripped, scrapped, melted, her steel reborn in other hulls, other girders. On some quiet nights in the North Atlantic, when weather and traffic reports are thin, older radio officers still half-jokingly say they listen for the Morning Star call sign. Younger men and women roll their eyes. Ghost ships, they say, belong to penny dreadfuls and old films, not to GPS tracks and satellite AIS. They are not entirely wrong. We track steel now with signals and screens. We can watch the dots of ships crawl across charts in real time, watch them blink and turn. It is hard, in that glow of data, to remember that none of it changes the old relationship between people and places where signals do not go. There are still dead zones, blind patches. Fog, whether of weather or of mind, still rolls in. The Atlantic ghost ship incident survives less as a belief that the Morning Star still haunts those coordinates, and more as a pattern people recognize in other contexts. Ask a miner about the old drift where everyone gets strange headaches, and he'll tell you about gas and old beams, and perhaps quietly about voices. Ask a soldier about a certain valley or a certain house at the end of a road, and you may hear about a place where N heard their names called from directions that made no tactical sense. Ask a crisis negotiator about the calls that come into their line, and they may talk about times when they felt contact from something deeper than the person speaking, something trying very hard to answer itself in familiar phrases. We live, most of us, far from derelicts and fog banks, but we are still tugged daily by voices that know just enough about us to sound right. Whole industries now are built on that. Targeted messages speaking in our language, tuned to our fears, telling us which way everyone else is going and hinting that we, too, should answer. We like to think we are not so easily led as sailors in 1907. Perhaps, or perhaps we've just traded one kind of sea for another. The men who carved "Don't Answer Them" into the Morning Star's deck did not do so because they thought never responding to any call was wise. They did it because, by the time the knife bit that paint, they had learned the hard way that some calls, the ones that sound most like coming home, can be invitations to step off the only solid thing left under your feet. They didn't get to finish the sentence. We do. This has been the Outland Archives. Case File 1907-09, Atlantic Ghost Ship Incident. They towed a vessel crewed by the dead. Until next time, keep your hawsers strong, keep your own watch honest, and if ever you find yourself in a calm place, with too smooth water and no good reason for it, and you hear a voice in the fog that should not be there, telling you to come closer, remember the morning star, and just once, let it talk, without answering back.